At 7:18 local time over the Persian Gulf, the first sign appeared on radar as a single red mark at the edge of the screen. It was small, low, and moving quickly enough to demand attention. Inside the operations center of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds. No one raised their voice. No one jumped to conclusions. The operator leaned closer to his console, watching the track move across the digital map from the northeast, just above the waterline, bearing 041. Range, 68 nautical miles. Altitude, unstable. Then a second contact appeared behind it, then a third. Then the screen began to fill. In only moments, what first looked like one low-flying aircraft turned into a spreading formation, multiple unmanned aerial contacts. No transponder, no IFF, no radio response. Each one moving toward the carrier strike group from different angles. Outside, the Persian Gulf looked calm. Morning light stretched across the gray-blue water. On the flight deck, crews were still moving around parked Super Hornets, securing equipment, checking tie-downs, and preparing for what was supposed to be another routine cycle of operations. From the outside, the carrier looked steady, massive, and untouchable. But deep inside the ship, behind armored bulkheads and glowing tactical displays, the crew already understood that routine was over. The tactical action officer stepped behind the radar operator. Confirm classification. The operator kept his eyes locked on the screen. Multiple low-altitude aerial tracks, possible UAV swarm, no friendly identification. That was enough. A message moved instantly across the strike group through Link 16. The carrier was not operating alone. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers on the outer screen received the same tactical picture. A cruiser farther aft began tracking the same contacts. Across the formation, every radar, every electronic support system, and every defense console shifted from quiet observation to full evaluation. The first warning went out over open frequencies. Unidentified aircraft. This is a United States Navy vessel operating in international waters. Alter course immediately. There was no response. A second warning followed. Still nothing. At 7:20, the contacts began to spread apart. That was the moment everything changed. A random drone usually moves in a straight line. A lost aircraft wanders. A commercial system drifts. But these contacts were separating into lanes, each one taking a different approach toward the carrier group. One cluster stayed low over the surface. Another moved wide to starboard. A third group slowed slightly, trailing behind as if waiting for the first wave to reveal the American response. This was not confusion. This was coordination. The order came down calm and direct. Set general quarters across the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The alarm rolled through the steel corridors. Sailors moved instantly. Boots thundered down ladders. Watertight doors sealed. Damage control teams took their positions. Medical stations prepared. On the flight deck, crew chiefs began clearing personnel from exposed areas. Aircraft handlers secured jets and equipment in case the ship had to maneuver without warning. There was no panic, only movement. The United States Navy prepares for the moment when the sky no longer looks empty. And now, that moment had reached the CIC. Inside the Combat Information Center, the number of tracks kept rising. 8 contacts, 11, 15, possibly more. The swarm was staying low, using the curve of the Earth and the noise of the sea surface to make detection harder. At that altitude, radar never gets a simple picture. Waves reflect signals. Heat rises from the water. Small targets appear for one sweep, then fade into the clutter before showing up again. But a carrier strike group is designed for exactly this kind of challenge. The spy radar arrays aboard the escort ships continued scanning. Electronic warfare teams began collecting signal patterns. Every pulse, every short transmission, every change in direction was recorded and analyzed. These drones were not only moving closer, they were communicating, they were adjusting, they were reacting. At 7:22, one of the destroyers called in. Multiple tracks now maneuvering, possible hostile pattern developing. On the bridge of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the captain stood facing the open water. To the naked eye, there was nothing there. No smoke, no aircraft, no visible sign of danger. Only the Persian Gulf stretching toward the horizon. That was what made it so serious. The threat was still too far away to see, but already close enough to matter. The captain gave the order calmly. Maintain formation. Weapons tight. Track everything. Weapons tight meant discipline. It meant no one acted out of fear. No system was used unless the threat crossed the line from suspicious to clearly hostile. That restraint was not weakness. It was control. And control is what keeps a carrier strike group alive under pressure. At 7:23, the first group of drones dropped even lower. Their altitude became unstable as they skimmed just above the water, disappearing briefly into sea clutter before returning on the next radar sweep. The second group widened its angle, pushing out to starboard and forcing the escorts to divide their attention. The third group stayed behind them, still holding back. The tactical action officer watched the display and understood the shape of what was unfolding. The first wave was not meant to overwhelm the carrier by itself. It was meant to stretch the defense. It was meant to make the Americans reveal their response. Then another contact appeared behind the swarm, larger, higher, farther out. It was not closing quickly. It was not descending. It was simply holding position beyond the main drone formation. The operator marked it immediately. New track, possible control platform. For the first time, the CIC became completely still. Because if that assessment was correct, the swarm was not operating on its own. Something behind it was watching the carrier, feeding the drones information, and waiting to see how the United States Navy would respond. At 7:24, the carrier strike group had not launched a weapon, but every system was awake. And the drones were still coming. At 7:25 local time, the drone swarm stopped looking like a scattered cloud. It became a formation. On the tactical display inside the USS Theodore Roosevelt's Combat Information Center, the contacts began separating into 3 clear waves. Wave 1 dropped lower, skimming just above the surface of the Persian Gulf. Wave 2 pushed wider to starboard, stretching the threat picture across the strike group's defensive screen. Wave 3 slowed behind them, holding distance as if it was waiting for the first 2 groups to reveal the carrier's response. That was the detail that made everyone pay attention. A simple threat moved straight ahead. This one was studying them. The tactical action officer stood behind the main console with his arms folded, his eyes locked on the screen. Every passing second added another piece to the picture. Bearing changes, speed shifts, altitude drops, short signal bursts. The drones were not moving at random. They were adjusting around each other, forcing the carrier strike group to watch several approach lanes at the same time. Range 52 nautical miles. Closing. The first warning had already received no answer. The second warning had also been ignored. Then a third transmission went out across both civilian and military frequencies. Unidentified unmanned aircraft. This is a United States Navy carrier strike group operating in international waters. You are approaching a protected formation. Alter course immediately. Static. No voice, no acknowledgement, no change in course. On the outer screen, the destroyers began tightening their defensive posture. Their spy radar arrays swept the horizon, separating small aerial targets from wave clutter and heat distortion. The Aegis combat system was already building the intercept picture, assigning numbers to each track, calculating closure rates, and deciding which contacts could become the most urgent first. The carrier stayed steady. That mattered. A carrier does not endure a crisis by reacting wildly. It survives by turning every escort, every aircraft, every radar, and every sailor into one controlled system. The Theodore Roosevelt did not turn away from the swarm. It held formation while the screen around it sharpened. Inside the CIC, the contacts continued to spread. Wave 1 was now holding extremely low altitude. Several tracks disappeared between radar sweeps, then returned closer than before. They were using the sea itself as cover. At that height, even advanced radar has to work against the horizon. The ocean reflects energy. Waves create false returns. Small objects blur into surface clutter. But the United States Navy had seen this kind of pattern before. Electronic warfare teams began collecting emissions from the swarm. The signals were short, broken, and irregular, but they were present. Burst transmissions, small corrections, control pulses, enough to show that these drones were not simply following preset routes. Someone was still communicating with them. At 7:26, a destroyer on the starboard side reported a change. Track 204 accelerating, bearing steady, possible hostile profile. The room became even quieter. Possible hostile profile meant the drone was no longer just moving toward the formation. Its speed, course, and altitude now matched a direct danger path. Not a surveillance pass, not a warning flight, a possible final approach. The captain's voice came through the command net. Maintain weapons tight, prepare layered defense. Weapons tight. The words mattered. No one was acting yet. No system would be used without confirmation of hostile intent. That restraint was not hesitation. It was discipline. And discipline was the difference between control and escalation. On the flight deck, the visible world had already changed. Sailors moved in sharp, controlled bursts across the non-skid surface. Aircraft handlers pulled exposed equipment away from open areas. Ordnance crews stepped back from armed aircraft. A Super Hornet near the catapult was secured in place, its nose pointed toward the open Gulf, unable to launch until the air picture was safe. Above them, the sky looked empty. That was what made the moment feel unreal. Dozens of unseen contacts were moving toward the carrier, and not one of them could be seen with the human eye. At 7:27, Wave 2 widened again. The drones spread outward like claws, opening around the formation. One group angled toward the starboard escort. Another shifted toward the carrier's forward sector. A third moved toward the gap between the cruiser and the destroyer, testing the seam where defensive coverage overlapped. The system caught it immediately. Aegis marked the adjustment the moment it happened. The formation was not simply facing an incoming threat. It was being tested. The tactical action officer leaned toward the electronic warfare officer. "Find the control path." The answer came back within seconds. "Working it. Multiple burst sources. Directional data inconsistent." That was not a comforting answer. It meant the drones were not relying on one clean, easy-to-trace signal. Either the control path was being relayed through several points, or the swarm had enough onboard logic to keep moving even if the link was disrupted. Either way, the distance was shrinking. Range 41 nautical miles. At 7:29, the first drone made its move. Track 204 dropped lower, then picked up speed. Its course stabilized directly toward the carrier's outer defensive ring. Two other tracks changed course almost immediately after, as if responding to the same instruction. The destroyer's combat system flagged all three. Vampire profile, low and inbound. Word carried weight. In naval operations, Vampire is not a casual warning. It means an inbound threat has been identified and is moving on a dangerous path. The captain gave the next order. Designate hostile if they cross the engagement line. Across every ship in the formation, defensive systems came fully awake. Vertical launch cells stood ready. Close-range protection systems turned toward the threat axis. CIWS mounts shifted from standby into tracking mode. Electronic countermeasure systems began shaping a controlled wall of interference across the swarm's approach path. The drones kept coming. At 7:30, Wave 1 crossed the outer threshold. The classification changed. Hostile. Still, the Theodore Roosevelt did not break formation. The carrier held its line. The escorts held their stations. The crew held to their training. Inside the CIC, the tactical action officer watched the tracks turn red on the display. Engagement authority passed to screen commander. The first defensive layer of the carrier strike group was now cleared to respond. But before the next order came, another signal appeared behind the swarm. Stronger than before. Higher. Farther out. It was holding position beyond the drone formation. The same possible control platform from earlier was transmitting again. The electronic warfare officer looked up from his console. "We have a burst transmission from the rear contact. The swarm is responding." The tactical action officer stared at the display. That changed the entire picture. The drones were not only moving in, they were being guided. And at 7:31, with the first wave closing fast and the carrier still untouched, the United States Navy prepared to turn the sky ahead into a layered defensive trap. At 7:33 local time, the order came through the command net with complete calm. Hostile intent confirmed. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the tactical display changed in an instant. The first wave of Iranian drones, still skimming low over the Persian Gulf, shifted from monitored contacts to hostile tracks. There was no applause, no shouting, no dramatic pause, only procedure. The carrier strike group moved from warning to engagement. On the outer screen, the lead Arleigh Burke-class destroyer took control of the first intercept sequence. Its Aegis combat system had already been watching the swarm for several minutes, measuring every movement, every speed change, and every drop in altitude. Now the system began sorting the targets by urgency. Track 204, low altitude, direct course. Closing fast, track 211, starboard approach, possible distraction, track 215, unstable altitude, potential final approach profile. The system did not care what the drones looked like. It cared where they were heading, and they were heading toward the carrier. Engage priority tracks. From the forward vertical launch cells of the destroyer, the first interceptor rose in a white column of fire. It climbed sharply, rolled toward the horizon, and dropped into the low-altitude engagement corridor. A second interceptor followed, then a third. From the flight deck of the Theodore Roosevelt, sailors still could not see the drones. They could only see the interceptors rising from the escort ship and bending toward what looked like an empty patch of morning sky. Then the first flash appeared low over the water. A sharp burst of light. A dark smear. Fragments falling into the Gulf. Splash 1, 2 seconds later, another flash. Splash 2. The carrier held course. That mattered more than it seemed. In a drone swarm approach, the purpose is not only to reach the target, it is to create movement, pressure, and confusion. It tries to make the formation turn too sharply, open gaps, lose coordination, or force escort ships into each other's defensive lanes. The Theodore Roosevelt did none of that. She stayed steady while the screen around her did its work. Inside the CIC, the operator tracked the next movement. Wave 1 was breaking apart, but not quickly enough. Several drones had disappeared into sea clutter during the first intercepts. Now, 2 of them reappeared closer than expected. Both lower than before, both still inbound. Leakers bearing 047, range 21 nautical miles. The tactical action officer turned toward the electronic warfare station. Begin soft kill measures. The electronic warfare suite came alive. Unlike an interceptor launch, there was nothing visible to watch. No fire, no smoke, no roar from the deck. But across the invisible electromagnetic spectrum, the carrier strike group began pushing back. Controlled jamming swept across the control frequencies detected earlier. Signal patterns were shaped, narrowed, and directed toward the incoming drones. One of the low tracks began to wobble. Its speed dropped. Its heading shifted 5 degrees left, then 7 degrees right. Then it disappeared from the radar picture. Track lost. Possible water impact. No one celebrated. Another drone kept coming. At 7:35, Wave 2 began its move. The second group had been waiting wide on the starboard side. Now it accelerated, using the first engagement to force the destroyers to divide their attention. 3 tracks angled toward the starboard escort. 2 others turned toward the gap between the cruiser and the carrier. Aegis responded faster than any human team could. Target assignments shifted across the formation. One destroyer took the low starboard tracks. The cruiser took the centerline threats. The Theodore Roosevelt's own close-in defensive systems remained ready, but silent. They were being held in reserve for anything that managed to break through. Layered defense. That was the entire doctrine. Stop the threat far out whenever possible. Disrupt it as it gets closer. And neutralize anything that survives before it can reach the carrier. At 7:36, the starboard destroyer launched. 2 interceptors streaked out, crossed paths above the sea, and dropped toward the incoming wave. The first drone disappeared in a flash above the water. The second tried to shift course, but the interceptor corrected faster, meeting it just above the surface. A third drone survived. It dropped lower, disappearing into sea clutter. For 6 seconds, nobody had a clean track. And inside a CIC, 6 seconds can feel endless. Then it reappeared at 12 nautical miles. Close-in systems tracking on the starboard escort. CRAM rotated toward the threat axis. Its sensors locked, the launcher elevated, the firing solution stabilized. Engage. The interceptor left the rail and crossed the short distance in seconds. The drone vanished in a sharp flash of light and debris. Confirmed intercept. But the swarm had already done part of what it was designed to do. It had forced the carrier strike group to reveal 3 layers of response: long-range interceptors, electronic warfare, and close-in missile defense. And behind the swarm, the larger contact was still holding position, still watching. At 7:38, the most dangerous track appeared. It emerged on the carrier's starboard quarter, extremely low, its radar return broken by the surface of the Gulf. It had not been the fastest drone. It had not been the highest. It had simply lasted long enough to become the main problem. Range 6 nautical miles. Closing. The tactical action officer spoke more sharply now. Leaker, starboard side, low altitude. Carrier defense, engage. For the first time, the Theodore Roosevelt's own defensive systems turned directly toward the incoming contact. CRAM locked. CIWS moved into position. Electronic warfare pushed harder against the control link. The drone kept coming. Range 5 nautical miles, then 4, then 3. On the bridge, the captain looked out across the water. Still nothing was visible. Only horizon, sunlight, and an empty sky. Inside the CIC, the drone was no longer just a symbol on the screen. It was seconds away from entering the final defensive ring. Standby CIWS. The close-in weapon system tracked automatically. The barrel assembly aligned, waiting for the final command. Then the drone staggered. Its track bent right, then left, then dropped sharply. The electronic warfare officer leaned forward. Control link disrupted. The drone fell out of formation, struck the surface, skipped once across the water, and burst apart short of the carrier. The flash was distant, but close enough for the deck crew to feel the vibration through the soles of their boots. Inside the CIC, the call came through. Threat neutralized. For 1 second, the tactical display looked cleaner. Then Wave 3 accelerated. Not wide, not scattered, straight in. The operator watched the final group tighten into a direct approach line. Wave 3 is inbound. Multiple tracks, higher speed. The tactical action officer stared at the screen. The first 2 waves had tested the wall. The third was trying to break through it. And at 7:39, Aegis began preparing the next defensive sequence. At 7:42 local time, the first 2 waves were gone. They had come in low, fast, and coordinated, trying to stretch the carrier strike group's defensive screen across multiple threat lanes. They had forced interceptor launches. They had triggered electronic warfare. They had pushed one drone close enough for the Theodore Roosevelt's own close-in defensive systems to activate. But they had not touched the carrier. Now the situation changed. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical display no longer showed a swarm closing from every direction. It showed scattered debris fields, fading radar tracks, and one contact that mattered more than every drone already removed from the picture. The rear contact was still there, farther north, at higher altitude, holding outside the main engagement zone. It had not moved forward with the swarm. It had not pulled back when the first interceptors launched. It had stayed in position, sending short bursts every time the drones changed formation. The electronic warfare officer leaned over his console, monitoring signals no human ear could interpret on its own. "We are getting another burst from the rear contact." The tactical action officer looked up. Direction consistent with previous source, bearing 058, range still outside the inner engagement zone. The meaning was clear. The drones were not simply following a preset route. Something behind them had been feeding corrections, watching the carrier's defenses and adjusting the operation as it unfolded. The swarm had been the blade. That contact was the hand holding it. Across the strike group, electronic support teams began triangulating the signal. Each ship received the burst from a slightly different angle. The destroyer to starboard marked it first. The cruiser aft confirmed it seconds later. The Theodore Roosevelt's own sensors added a third line of bearing. 3 invisible lines crossed on the tactical display. There, a point in open water and open sky where nothing should have been. But the United States Navy does not trust empty space. It checks it. At 7:43, an E-2D Hawkeye orbiting farther back from the strike group shifted its radar focus toward the suspected source. The aircraft's powerful sensor suite swept the area, searching through altitude layers, surface returns, and clutter beyond the main drone corridor. A contact emerged, larger than the earlier drones, slower, holding altitude, not broadcasting a civilian transponder. The Hawkeye crew passed the information back through the network. Possible unmanned control platform, track stable, no friendly identification. Inside the CIC, no one needed that translated. The carrier had not only been approached, it had been studied. Every interceptor launched, every radar mode activated, and every jamming pattern used against the swarm could become information for whoever was watching. A drone operation can damage equipment. A probe can collect knowledge. This looked like both. The captain's voice came through the net. "Do not lose that contact." The final wave was still inbound. At 7:44, Wave 3 accelerated. Unlike the earlier groups, it did not widen. It did not test the seams. It formed a tighter line and moved straight in, as if the control platform had stopped measuring and decided to use what remained. Range 22 nautical miles. Closing fast. The screen commander assigned targets immediately. The starboard destroyer took the first 2. The cruiser took the center tracks. The portside destroyer shifted its defensive arc to cover anything that might slip through. The Theodore Roosevelt remained the protected asset at the center of the formation, steady and silent, while every escort around her prepared to stop the final wave before it could reach the carrier. Engage Wave 3. The first interceptor launched at 7:45. Then another. Then another. White columns of smoke rose from the destroyers and bent sharply toward the horizon. On the tactical display, the geometry unfolded in real time. Interceptors climbing, drones closing, intercept points forming like invisible gates in the air. The first drone disappeared in a flash. Splash 1. The second broke apart moments later. Splash 2. The third drone changed altitude suddenly, climbing just enough to create a new approach angle toward the carrier's flight deck. That was a mistake. The cruiser's combat system recalculated instantly. An interceptor crossed the sky from aft to forward, meeting the drone before it could settle into its new path. A small, bright flash opened above the water, and fragments fell harmlessly into the Gulf. Priority track neutralized, but 3 drones were still moving. At 7:47, the control platform transmitted again. This time, the burst was stronger. The remaining drones responded almost immediately. Their spacing changed. 2 split left, 1 dropped lower, hiding in sea clutter. The electronic warfare officer called it out. "They are correcting live." The tactical action officer did not hesitate. "Jam the path." A narrow beam targeted the control link. The strike group pushed back through the spectrum. No visible weapon left the carrier. No flame rose from the deck. But across the electromagnetic battlespace, the United States Navy began cutting into the invisible connection between the drones and the platform guiding them. 1 drone drifted off course. Another began losing altitude. The third kept coming. Range 8 nautical miles. CRAM tracked. The launcher turned. The interceptor fired. Seconds later, the drone vanished in a sharp white flash. Confirmed intercept. The second drone fell into the sea before it entered the inner ring, its link broken and its course collapsing into the water. That left one. It was the lowest track yet. For several seconds, radar lost it completely. The CIC settled into controlled silence. Then it reappeared. Range 3 nautical miles. Bearing starboard quarter. Leaker, carrier defense, engage. The Theodore Roosevelt's CIWS slewed into position. CRAM locked. Electronic warfare pushed maximum directed interference into the detected control band. The drone kept coming. 2.5 miles, 2 miles. Then its path bent sharply, as if the invisible hand guiding it had suddenly been knocked away. It dropped, skipped across the surface, and broke apart short of the carrier. The blast rolled across the water. No impact, no damage, no injuries. At 7:49, the screen was clear. All inbound drones neutralized. For one brief second, the carrier strike group had won the defensive fight. Then the rear contact turned north. It was leaving. Inside the CIC, the tactical action officer watched the line shift on the display. The control platform had seen enough. It had lost the swarm. It had exposed its signal, and now it was trying to get away before the United States Navy could complete the picture. The captain's order came immediately. Track it. Launch fighters. On the flight deck, 2 F/A-18 Super Hornets were already waiting. Their engines came alive. The swarm had failed. Now the United States was going after the source. At 7:56 local time, the flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt came to life. 2 F/A-18 Super Hornets sat locked onto the catapults, engines roaring, wings loaded for air defense and extended range. Around them, deck crews moved with the kind of precision that only comes after thousands of launches under pressure. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just hand signals, steam, heat, and steel. The drone swarm had failed. Every inbound track had been stopped before reaching the carrier. The first wave had been broken by interceptors. The second had been disrupted by electronic warfare and close-in defense. The third had tried to push straight through the formation and was stopped before it could reach the Theodore Roosevelt. But the situation was not over. The contact behind the swarm was leaving. Farther north, beyond the main engagement zone, the larger platform had turned away from the carrier strike group. Its signal bursts had gone quiet. Its course had shifted toward open airspace. Whatever had been guiding the drones had seen enough. Now it wanted distance. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer watched the contact pull away on the display. Control node is withdrawing. The captain's response was immediate. Launch! The first Super Hornet shot forward. Steam erupted across the deck as the catapult sent the jet into the morning sky. The aircraft dropped for half a second, then climbed hard over the Persian Gulf, afterburners glowing beneath its tail. The second Hornet followed moments later, rolling off the bow and banking north. Above the strike group, the air picture tightened again. The E-2D Hawkeye held its orbit farther back, feeding the fighters a clean track. The destroyers kept their radars active, watching for any second swarm, any launch, or any hidden danger still waiting beyond the horizon. The Theodore Roosevelt stayed at the center of the formation, steady, untouched. The Super Hornets did not rush blindly toward the contact, they moved with control. One aircraft held slightly higher, the other stayed lower and offset, creating a bracket around the suspected control platform's projected route. Their radars remained disciplined, their passive sensors worked first. In modern air operations, the aircraft that broadcasts too much can reveal itself too soon. The American fighters did not need to announce themselves. They could listen. At 8:01, the lead pilot received the updated vector. Contact bearing 056, range 43 nautical miles. Medium altitude, no friendly identification, no transponder. The pilot acknowledged. Viper flight copies. Ahead of them, the unknown platform continued north. It was larger than the attack drone, slower than a fighter, and still refusing to identify itself. It had stayed outside the main engagement area while the swarm tested the carrier's defenses. It had transmitted when the drones maneuvered. It had gone silent when the final wave collapsed. That pattern told the story. The platform had not been drifting. It had been involved. At 8:03, the Super Hornets closed the distance. The lead aircraft moved to the left side of the contact's projected path. The wingman shifted right and lower. This was not a strike formation. Not yet. It was containment. A controlled intercept designed to place American aircraft directly in the path of a platform that had just supported a hostile drone approach toward a United States carrier strike group. The radio call went out. Unidentified aircraft, this is United States Navy aircraft. You are operating near a United States carrier strike group following hostile unmanned aerial activity. Alter course away from the formation immediately. No response. The lead pilot repeated the call. Still nothing. Then the contact transmitted again. A short burst, less than 2 seconds. Back aboard the Theodore Roosevelt, the electronic warfare team caught it instantly. Burst transmission detected. Same signal family as the previous control link. The tactical action officer leaned closer to the display. Direction northbound. Likely exfiltration data. That was the final piece. The platform was not simply leaving, it was trying to send home what it had collected: radar reactions, jamming patterns, interceptor timing, defensive geometry. The kind of information foreign operators can spend years trying to gather against a United States carrier strike group. But the attempt had already cost them. Every signal had been recorded. Every drone movement had been tracked. Every reaction from the swarm had been logged by American systems. The same probe meant to study the carrier had revealed the network behind it. At 8:05, the lead Super Hornet moved closer. Not close enough to create danger, close enough to be seen, close enough for the operators behind that contact, wherever they were, to understand the message. You have been found. The Hornet's radar came up just long enough to mark the contact clearly. The unknown aircraft reacted almost immediately. Its course shifted north by 10 degrees, then 20. Then it began a steady withdrawal away from the carrier strike group. Inside the CIC, the operator called it out. Control platform is disengaging. No one cheered. The Theodore Roosevelt did not need celebration. The tactical picture said enough. The swarm was gone. The source had been identified. The carrier remained untouched. The strike group had held its discipline, protected the ship, and forced the hostile system to turn away without losing control of the situation. At 8:12, the sky was clear. No inbound drones, no hostile tracks inside the defensive ring, no damage reported across the carrier or its escorts. On the flight deck, sailors began returning to their stations. Aircraft handlers checked tie-downs. Ordnance crews inspected launch areas. Damage control teams reported all compartments secure. The carrier resumed controlled operations, but no one confused calm with safety. Out on the water, small pieces of drone debris drifted in the wake of the formation. It was the only physical evidence of an operation that had failed before it ever reached its target. In the end, the swarm came in low, fast, and silent. It tried to split the radar picture, stretch the defensive screen, and pressure an American carrier into disorder. It failed. The United States Navy saw the threat, shared the picture, layered the defense, stopped the approach, and identified the source behind it. Iranian drones came looking for weakness. They found a carrier strike group. So here is the question. If you were standing inside that combat information center, watching a drone swarm close on a United States aircraft carrier in real time, would you focus only on stopping the drones, or would you go after the platform guiding them? Drop your answer in the comments, because out here, the ocean does not forgive hesitation. And when a United States aircraft carrier is threatened, the answer does not come in speeches. It comes through radar discipline, trained crews, and a sky cleared before the danger ever gets close.